The courthouse steps in Flagstaff, Arizona were burning hot under the August sun when Martha Kellerman walked up them for what everyone assumed would be the last time. At 73, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and wearing her best navy dress, she looked like any other grandmother heading to handle some mundane legal matter. But Martha wasn't there for probate or property transfer. She was there to file a lawsuit that would shake the foundations of Northern Arizona University and prove that age was just a number when it came to fighting for what's right. The security guard at the entrance barely glanced at her as she passed through the metal detector. The clerk at the filing window processed her paperwork with routine efficiency. None of them realized they were witnessing the beginning of a battle that would make national headlines and change the lives of countless older Americans across the country. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Martha Kellerman had always been a fighter, though you wouldn't know it from looking at her modest ranch house on the outskirts of Flagstaff. The single-story home with its desert landscaping and chain-link fence looked like 1,000 others in the neighborhood, but inside those walls lived a woman who had spent 47 years dedicated to education, first as a high school English teacher and later as a professor of American literature at Northern Arizona University. She had earned her doctorate at the age of 42, juggling coursework with raising 3 children and supporting her husband through his own career as a forest ranger. Those were the days when female professors were rare, and older female professors were practically unicorns. But Martha had persevered, publishing papers on Mark Twain and Emily Dickinson that earned respect from colleagues half her age. The trouble began on a crisp October morning in 2019. Martha was in her office in the Humanities Building, grading papers from her Victorian literature class, when Department Chair Dr. Bradley Hutchins knocked on her door. At 55, Hutchins was the kind of man who wore his authority like an expensive suit, visible from across the room and tailored to intimidate. "Martha, do you have a moment?" he asked, though his tone suggested it wasn't really a question. She looked up from the stack of essays about George Eliot, noting how Hutchins hovered in the doorway rather than taking a seat. After 3 decades in academia, she had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded difficult conversations. "Of course, Bradley. Come in." He remained standing, hands clasped behind his back. "I've been reviewing the teaching assignments for next semester, and I wanted to discuss your course load." Martha set down her red pen and gave him her full attention. At 71, she was still teaching 4 classes per semester, maintaining the same schedule she'd kept for years. Her student evaluations remained consistently high, and her courses filled up quickly during registration. "I'm concerned about the sustainability of your current workload," Hutchins continued, his voice taking on what Martha recognized as his practiced diplomatic tone. "Perhaps it's time to consider reducing your teaching responsibilities. Are you suggesting I move to part-time status?" Martha asked, though she suspected the conversation was heading somewhere far more permanent. Hutchins shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "Actually, Martha, I think we need to discuss retirement. You've had an incredible career, but at your age, well, perhaps it's time to step back and enjoy your golden years." The phrase golden years hit Martha like a physical blow. She had heard it countless times from well-meaning friends and family members, always delivered with a patronizing smile that suggested her most productive days were behind her. "My performance reviews have been exemplary," she said carefully. "My students consistently rate my classes among the highest in the department. I'm not sure I understand the concern." Hutchins sighed, as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Martha, you're 71 years old. Don't you think it's time to let the younger generation take over? We have some brilliant new PhD graduates who are eager for teaching opportunities." There it was, the assumption that had been lurking beneath the surface of countless interactions over the past few years. The idea that her age automatically disqualified her from contributing meaningfully to the academic community, regardless of her experience, knowledge, or effectiveness as an educator. "Are you saying that my age is the primary factor in this decision?" Martha asked, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. "I'm saying that we need to be realistic about the future of the department." Hutchins replied. Resources are limited, and we have to make strategic decisions about where to invest our energy. Martha stood up slowly, her full height of 5 feet 6 inches, suddenly seeming more imposing. Bradley, I've been teaching longer than some of our current faculty have been alive. I have institutional knowledge that can't be replaced by enthusiasm alone. My students benefit from my experience, and I'm not ready to step aside simply because you think I'm too old to matter. The phrase hung in the air between them like a challenge. Hutchins' expression hardened. Martha, I'm trying to be kind here. But the reality is that the university is moving in a new direction. We need faculty who can adapt to changing technologies, who understand the current student body, who can bring fresh perspectives to their teaching. And you believe that someone my age is incapable of adaptation? Martha asked. I believe that someone your age has different priorities, Hutchins said. You should be thinking about travel, spending time with grandchildren and enjoying retirement. This job is demanding, and frankly, it's not fair to you or to the students to continue when you're past your prime. Past her prime. The words echoed in Martha's mind as she watched Hutchins leave her office, promising to think about what we discussed and to consider what's best for everyone involved. That evening, Martha sat in her kitchen with a cup of tea, staring out at the desert landscape that had been her home for more than 4 decades. The ponderosa pines swayed in the evening breeze, their massive trunks a testament to the strength that came with age and deep roots. She thought about her students, bright young minds who challenged her thinking and kept her intellectually engaged. She thought about the research project she was working on, examining the influence of regional newspapers on frontier literature. She thought about the upcoming conference where she was scheduled to present her findings. None of these things felt like the activities of someone who was past her prime. The next morning, Martha was back in her office early, reviewing her contract and the university's policies on age discrimination. She had always been meticulous about documentation, and her personnel files painted a clear picture of a faculty member who had consistently exceeded expectations. Over the following weeks, the pressure intensified. Hutchins began scheduling department meetings during times when Martha taught her classes, then expressing disappointment when she couldn't attend. He assigned her to serve on a committee that met at 7 in the morning, commenting that early mornings might be challenging at your age. The subtle campaign of marginalization culminated 3 weeks later when Martha received an email from the dean's office. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, dean of the College of Liberal Arts, requested a meeting to discuss Martha's transition planning. Martha arrived at the dean's office on a gray November morning, the first snow of the season dusting the campus grounds. Dean Reynolds, a woman in her early 60s with prematurely gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, greeted her with the kind of forced warmth that Martha had come to recognize as institutional politeness. Martha, thank you for coming. Please, have a seat. The dean's office was an imposing space with dark wood paneling and diplomas covering nearly every wall. Martha settled into the leather chair across from Reynolds' massive desk, noting how the seating arrangement was designed to emphasize the power dynamic. I understand Bradley has spoken with you about your future with the university, Reynolds began, consulting a file that Martha assumed contained her entire career history. He has expressed some concerns about my age, Martha replied evenly. Well, I wouldn't characterize it that way, Reynolds said, though her expression suggested otherwise. We're simply trying to plan for the future of the department. You've had a remarkable career, Martha. 47 years of service is something to be proud of. Martha noticed the past tense. I'm not finished yet, Patricia. Of course not, Reynolds said quickly. But we do need to be realistic about the changing landscape of higher education. Students today have different expectations, different learning styles. They need faculty who can relate to their experiences and challenges. And you believe that my age prevents me from connecting with students. Reynolds hesitated, clearly choosing her words carefully. I believe that there's tremendous value in having a mix of experienced faculty and fresh perspectives. Sometimes that means making room for new voices, by pushing out the old ones, by recognizing when it's time to celebrate a career well lived and embrace the next chapter. Martha felt a familiar surge of anger, but she kept her voice controlled. Patricia, my student evaluations are among the highest in the college. My research continues to be published in respected journals. I'm actively engaged in professional development and serve on multiple committees. What specific performance issues are driving this conversation? The dean's discomfort was palpable. Martha, this isn't about performance. It's about fit. It's about energy and enthusiasm and the ability to inspire the next generation of students. Are you saying that someone my age lacks energy and enthusiasm? I'm saying that someone your age has different priorities. You should be enjoying your retirement, not worrying about lesson plans and grading papers. There was that assumption again, that reaching a certain age automatically meant losing the passion and dedication that had defined Martha's career, as if the accumulation of years somehow diminished rather than enhanced her value as an educator. What if I disagree with your assessment? Martha asked. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. Reynolds' expression grew stern. Martha, I hope you'll consider what's best for the university. We're prepared to offer you a very generous retirement package. You could leave with your reputation intact and your legacy secure. The implicit threat was clear. Cooperate with their plan, or face the consequences. Martha left the dean's office with a sick feeling in her stomach. She had dedicated her life to Northern Arizona University, had helped shape the minds of thousands of students, and had contributed to the institution's reputation and growth. Now she was being told that her age made me a liability, that her experience was less valuable than the theoretical fresh perspectives of younger faculty. That evening, she called her daughter Sarah in Phoenix. Sarah was a successful attorney who had inherited her mother's fighting spirit along with her sharp intellect. Mom, what they're doing sounds like textbook age discrimination, Sarah said after hearing the full story. You can't just push someone out because they're older, especially when their performance is solid. They're not explicitly saying it's because of my age, Martha replied. They're using euphemisms, talking about fit and energy and fresh perspectives. That's even worse, Sarah said. They know they can't legally discriminate based on age, so they're using coded language to justify it. Do you want to fight this? Martha looked around her home office, filled with books and papers, and the accumulated wisdom of nearly 5 decades in education. On the wall hung her PhD diploma, earned through years of sacrifice and determination. Next to it was a photo from her first day of teaching, a young woman with dark hair and bright eyes, ready to change the world one student at a time. Yes, she said firmly, I want to fight this. The decision to resist wasn't just about her own career. Martha had spent her life watching capable women being pushed aside, their contributions minimized, their voices silenced. She had seen female colleagues forced into early retirement while their male counterparts continued working well into their 70s and 80s. She began documenting every interaction, every meeting, every subtle slight. She researched the university's hiring practices and discovered a pattern of pushing out older faculty members, particularly women, under the guise of renewal and revitalization. The final straw came in December, just before the winter break. Martha was in her office, preparing for her spring semester classes, when she received an email from Human Resources. The subject line read, Mandatory Retirement Discussion. The message was brief and professional, requesting that Martha schedule a meeting to discuss her retirement timeline and the transition of her responsibilities. There was no mention of choice, no acknowledgement of her right to continue working. It was presented as a fait accompli. Martha printed the email and added it to her growing file of documentation. Then she picked up her phone and called Sarah. I think it's time to find a lawyer, she said. The law office of Daniels & Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a modern glass building in downtown Phoenix, a 2-hour drive from Flagstaff that Martha had made countless times over the years. Attorney Rebecca Daniels was a woman in her early 40s with shoulder-length auburn hair and the kind of intense focus that made clients feel like their case was the most important thing in the world. Mrs. Kellerman, what you're describing is a classic case of age discrimination. Rebecca said, reviewing the thick folder of documentation that Martha had compiled over the past month. The language your supervisors used, the sudden pressure to retire despite excellent performance reviews, the targeting of older faculty members. It all fits the pattern. Martha sat across from Rebecca's desk, her hands folded in her lap, watching the attorney flip through emails, performance evaluations, and meeting notes. Each document represented a small humiliation, a subtle erosion of her professional dignity. The challenge, Rebecca continued, is that universities are sophisticated institutions. They rarely make explicit statements about age. Instead, they use euphemisms and create seemingly legitimate justifications for their decision. So, what are our options? Martha asked. We file a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission first, then pursue a federal lawsuit if necessary. But I need to be honest with you. These cases are expensive and time-consuming. The university has deep pockets and experienced attorneys. They'll fight this aggressively. Martha thought about her modest retirement savings, accumulated over decades of teaching. A legal battle could consume everything she had worked for. What are the chances of success? With your documentation and the clear pattern of discrimination, I'd say we have a strong case. But universities often settle these matters quietly rather than risk negative publicity. The question is whether you're prepared for what this process will demand. Martha looked out the window at the Phoenix skyline, the desert mountains visible in the distance. She thought about all the students she had taught, all the young women she had mentored, all the barriers she had already overcome in her career. I'm prepared, she said. The EEOC complaint was filed on January 15, 2020. Within 48 hours, Martha received a call from Dean Reynolds. Martha, I understand you've involved outside counsel in our discussions about your retirement, Reynolds said, her voice carefully neutral. I think there may be some misunderstanding about the university's intention. I don't think there's any misunderstanding, Martha replied. You want me to retire because of my age, and I'm not ready to do that. That's not accurate. We're simply trying to plan for the future of the department. Perhaps we can find a middle ground, maybe a reduced teaching load, or a transition to emeritus status with continued research opportunities. Martha recognized the offer for what it was, a face-saving compromise that would still accomplish the university's goal of removing her from the classroom. I'm not interested in middle ground, Patricia. I want to continue teaching at full capacity. The conversation ended with polite but strained pleasantries, both women understanding that the battle lines had been drawn. Over the following weeks, Martha noticed subtle changes in her work environment. Colleagues who had been friendly for years suddenly seemed uncomfortable around her. Her requests for research support were delayed or denied. Her opinions in faculty meetings were met with awkward silence. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the fight. Martha had spent her career as a respected member of the academic community, but now she felt like a pariah, someone who had violated the unspoken rules by refusing to gracefully accept her dismissal. The pressure intensified when Martha received her spring semester teaching schedule. Instead of her usual 4 courses, she had been assigned only 2, both introductory classes that were typically given to adjunct instructors or graduate students. It's a temporary adjustment, Department Chair Hutchins explained when Martha questioned the change. We're redistributing the advanced courses to faculty who can provide more continuity. Continuity? Martha asked. I've been teaching Victorian literature for 25 years. How much more continuity do you need? Hutchins avoided her eyes. The decision has been made, Martha. I suggest you focus on making the best of the situation. That evening, Martha called Rebecca Daniels with the news. The attorney's response was immediate and decisive. They're retaliating, Rebecca said. This is exactly the kind of behavior that strengthens our case. They're punishing you for filing the complaint. It feels like they're trying to force me out by making my job unbearable, Martha said. That's exactly what they're doing. It's called constructive dismissal, creating conditions so intolerable that a reasonable person would resign. But we're not going to let them get away with it. The next phase of the battle moved to the courtroom. The university's legal team was led by Harrison Matthews, a senior partner at one of Phoenix's most prestigious law firms. Matthews was known for his aggressive tactics and his ability to make plaintiffs feel like they were the ones on trial. The deposition process was grueling. Martha sat in a sterile conference room for hours, answering questions about her career, her performance, her health, her family life. Matthews probed every aspect of her professional history, looking for weaknesses or inconsistencies. "Mrs. Kellerman, isn't it true that you've had difficulty adapting to new technologies in the classroom?" Matthews asked during one particularly intense session. "I've learned to use every technology the university has implemented," Martha replied. "I use the online learning management system. I incorporate multimedia into my presentations. I communicate with students through email and discussion forums. But you've needed assistance with these technologies, haven't you? I've asked for help when I needed it, just like any faculty member would." The university provides technology support for all staff. Matthews leaned back in his chair, studying Martha with calculating eyes. "Mrs. Kellerman, don't you think that after 47 years in education, you've earned the right to enjoy your retirement?" The question was designed to make her seem selfish for continuing to work, as if her desire to remain productive was somehow inappropriate. Martha met his gaze steadily. "I think I've earned the right to decide when I'm ready to retire," she said. The university's defense strategy became clear during the discovery process. They portrayed Martha as a well-meaning but outdated professor who was clinging to her position despite declining effectiveness. They cited anonymous student comments about her old-fashioned teaching methods and her resistance to change. But Rebecca Daniels had been busy building the plaintiff's case. She had interviewed dozens of current and former faculty members, uncovering a pattern of age discrimination that went far beyond Martha's situation. Dr. James Wellington, a former chemistry professor, had been forced out at age 68, despite winning teaching awards throughout his career. Professor Linda Chen from the psychology department had been pressured to retire at 70, with administrators expressing concern about her energy level and ability to relate to students. "We found 12 faculty members over the past 5 years who were subjected to similar treatment," Rebecca explained to Martha during one of their strategy sessions. "All of them were over 65, all had excellent performance records, and all were pressured to retire using the same language and tactics." The most damaging evidence came from an internal university memo that had been inadvertently included in the discovery materials. The document, written by a human resources administrator, discussed the need to refresh the faculty and reduce the average age of our teaching staff. "This is our smoking gun," Rebecca said, holding up the memo. They put their discriminatory intent in writing. As the case progressed, Martha found herself becoming something of a local celebrity. The story of a 73-year-old professor fighting age discrimination resonated with older Americans across the country. She received letters of support from retired teachers, former students, and advocacy groups. The media attention was both empowering and overwhelming. Martha had always been a private person, but now she found herself giving interviews to newspapers and television stations, explaining why she refused to be pushed aside. "I'm not fighting just for myself," she told a reporter from the Arizona Republic. "I'm fighting for every older worker who has been told they're no longer valuable, every person who has been pushed out of their career because of their age." The university's response to the media coverage was swift and defensive. They issued statements emphasizing their commitment to diversity and inclusion, while carefully avoiding any mention of age discrimination. They highlighted their recent hiring of young faculty members and their innovative programs designed to attract millennial students. But the damage to their reputation was becoming apparent. Alumni began questioning the university's treatment of longtime faculty members. Donors expressed concern about the institution's values, student groups organized rallies supporting Martha, and calling for an end to age discrimination on campus. The turning point came during the testimony of Dr. Michael Torres, a colleague who had worked closely with Martha for 15 years. Torres was a respected professor in his early 60s, someone who had always maintained good relationships with the administration. "Martha Kellerman is one of the finest educators I've ever known," Torres testified under oath. "Her age has never been a barrier to her effectiveness. If anything, Her experience makes her more valuable, not less. When asked about the university's justification for pressuring Martha to retire, Torres was blunt. They wanted to get rid of the older faculty members to make room for cheaper younger hires. It had nothing to do with performance or student needs. The university's attorneys objected, but the damage was done. A respected faculty member had publicly contradicted their narrative and exposed their true motivations. As the trial date approached, Martha found herself experiencing a range of emotions she hadn't expected. There was anger at the injustice she had faced, but also a sense of purpose that energized her more than she had felt in years. She was no longer just a professor trying to keep her job. She had become a symbol of resistance against age discrimination, a voice for older workers who had been silenced by societal expectations and institutional prejudice. The night before the trial was scheduled to begin, Martha sat in her hotel room in Phoenix, reviewing her testimony notes. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a young teacher fresh out of college, to a seasoned professor fighting for her right to continue serving students. She thought about the letter she had received that morning from Elena Rodriguez, a former student who was now a successful novelist. Elena had written about how Martha's Victorian literature class had changed her life, introducing her to authors and ideas that had shaped her career. "You taught me that age brings wisdom, not irrelevance." Elena had written, "Thank you for showing me that experience is a gift, not a burden." Martha folded the letter carefully and placed it in her purse. Tomorrow she would walk into that courtroom and tell her story. She would face the university's attorneys and their attempts to diminish her value. She would stand up for every older worker who had been told they no longer mattered. The stakes were higher than just her own career now. The case had attracted national attention, and the outcome would send a message about how society values older workers and their contributions. As Martha prepared for sleep, she felt a sense of calm determination. She had spent her life educating others, and now she was about to teach the most important lesson of her career, that age should never be a barrier to pursuing one's passion and purpose. The trial would determine not just her future, but the future of older workers across the country who refused to be pushed aside because of their age. Martha Kellerman was ready to prove that she still had much to offer, and that her voice still mattered. The federal courthouse in Phoenix buzzed with activity on the morning of March 15, 2021. Martha arrived at 7:30, 90 minutes before proceedings were scheduled to begin, wearing her most professional charcoal gray suit and carrying a leather briefcase that had belonged to her late husband. The media presence was substantial: television crews from 3 local stations, reporters from the Arizona Republic and Phoenix New-Times, and a correspondent from National Public Radio who had been following the case for months. Judge Catherine Morrison presided over the courtroom with the kind of quiet authority that came from 25 years on the federal bench. At 62, Morrison had a reputation for fairness and an intolerance for legal theatrics. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. The jury selection had taken 2 full days. Rebecca Daniels had fought for a diverse panel that included older workers who might understand Martha's situation, while the university's attorneys had tried to exclude anyone who might be sympathetic to age discrimination claims. The final jury consisted of 12 individuals ranging in age from 28 to 64, representing a cross-section of Arizona's working population. Harrison Matthews opened for the defense with a strategy that Martha had expected but still found painful to hear. He portrayed her as a dedicated educator who had simply reached the natural end of her career, someone who was unable to accept the inevitable passage of time. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Matthews began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a seasoned trial attorney, "Dr. Martha Kellerman devoted her life to education, and Northern Arizona University is grateful for her 4 decades of service. But this case isn't about gratitude or respect. It's about a professor who refused to acknowledge that her effectiveness had diminished, who chose to fight rather than embrace a well-deserved retirement." Matthews painted a picture of a university administration that had tried to handle Martha's situation with sensitivity and compassion, only to be met with legal threats and public accusations. He emphasized the university's right to make personnel decisions based on institutional needs, not individual preferences. The evidence will show that Dr. Kellerman's teaching methods had become outdated, that her resistance to technological changes was hindering student learning, and that her inability to connect with modern students was affecting classroom dynamics. The university's suggestions about retirement were not discriminatory. They were the responsible actions of administrators trying to serve their students effectively. When Rebecca Daniels stood to deliver her opening statement, the courtroom atmosphere shifted. She had spent months preparing for this moment, and her confidence was evident from the first words she spoke. "Your Honor, members of the jury, this case is about one simple principle. No worker should be forced from their job because of their age." Martha Kellerman didn't become less intelligent when she turned 70. She didn't lose her passion for teaching or her ability to inspire students. The only thing that changed was how her employer perceived her value. Rebecca methodically outlined the evidence she would present: the pattern of discrimination affecting multiple faculty members, the internal memo revealing the university's true motivations, the testimony from colleagues and students who contradicted the administration's claims about Martha's effectiveness. The defendants will try to convince you that this was about performance, about institutional needs, about anything except age. But the evidence will show that Martha Kellerman was targeted for one reason: she was 71 years old, and her supervisors believed that made her expendable. The first witness called was Dr. Amanda Foster, a former student who had taken Martha's American Literature course in 2018. Foster was now completing her PhD at Stanford University and had flown to Phoenix specifically to testify. "Professor Kellerman changed my entire academic trajectory," Foster testified, her voice clear and confident. "I was a business major who took her class as an elective, but her passion for literature was so infectious that I switched my major to English. She didn't just teach us about books. She taught us how to think critically, how to question assumptions, how to find meaning in complex texts." Under cross-examination, Matthews attempted to undermine Foster's testimony by suggesting that her experience was from several years earlier, before Martha's alleged decline in effectiveness. But Foster held firm. "Professor Kellerman was as sharp and engaged in 2018 as any professor I've ever had," she said. "If anything, her years of experience made her more effective, not less." The testimony of Dr. James Wellington proved even more damaging to the university's case. Wellington, the former chemistry professor who had been forced out at 68, described a pattern of behavior that mirrored Martha's experience almost exactly. "They used the same language, the same tactics," Wellington testified. "First, they questioned my energy level. Then they expressed concern about my ability to relate to younger students. Finally, they offered me a generous retirement package and made it clear that refusing would have consequences." Wellington's voice trembled with emotion as he described the final meeting with his department chair. "He told me that I should be grateful for my long career and that it was time to make room for fresh blood. When I asked what that meant, he said the department needed professors who could bring new perspectives and innovative approaches to teaching." The cross-examination of Wellington was brutal. Matthews attacked his credibility, suggesting that he was a disgruntled former employee, seeking revenge against his former employer. He questioned Wellington's memory, his motivations, and his interpretation of events. But Wellington remained steadfast. "I'm not here for revenge," he said quietly. "I'm here because what happened to me is now happening to Martha, and it will keep happening to other older faculty members unless someone stops it." The most explosive testimony came from Dr. Sandra Hayes, a current faculty member in the English department who had agreed to testify despite the potential risk to her own career. Hayes was 59 years old and had already begun experiencing some of the same pressures that Martha had faced. "There's an unspoken understanding in the department," Hayes testified. "Once you reach a certain age, you're expected to start thinking about retirement. Not because your performance has declined, but because you're no longer seen as part of the university's future." Hayes described faculty meetings where older professors were subtly excluded from important decisions, where their ideas were dismissed as outdated, where their experience was treated as a liability rather than an asset. I've watched several colleagues pushed out over the past 5 years, she said. All of them were over 65. All had excellent teaching records, and all were pressured to retire using the same arguments about fresh perspectives and generational change. The university's attorneys objected repeatedly during Hayes's testimony, arguing that her opinions were speculative and irrelevant. But Judge Morrison allowed most of her testimony to stand, recognizing its relevance to establishing a pattern of discriminatory behavior. The smoking gun memo was introduced as evidence on the third day of testimony. Rebecca Daniels read key passages aloud to the jury, her voice emphasizing the discriminatory language that the university had hoped would remain hidden. The document states, and I quote, "Our faculty demographics show an aging workforce that may be hindering our ability to attract younger students and compete with more dynamic institutions. We need to develop strategies to refresh our teaching staff and reduce the average age of our faculty." The memo went on to identify specific departments where age-related concerns were most pronounced, with the English department listed as a top priority for renewal efforts. Matthews attempted to contextualize the memo during his cross-examination of the HR administrator who had written it. "Ms. Patterson, when you used the term refresh, you were referring to a normal process of faculty turnover, weren't you?" Patricia Patterson, a nervous woman in her 40s, shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair. "We were looking at ways to bring in new talent and perspective, and that's a legitimate institutional goal, isn't it?" "Yes, of course. You weren't suggesting that older faculty members should be fired because of their age, were you?" Patterson hesitated, clearly aware that her answer would be scrutinized. "We were looking at the overall composition of our faculty and considering how to maintain a healthy balance." But Rebecca Daniels was ready for the redirect examination. "Ms. Patterson, when you wrote about reducing the average age of the faculty, what did you mean by that?" "We wanted to bring in more young professors." "And how would you accomplish that goal?" Patterson's discomfort was obvious. "By hiring recent PhD graduates and encouraging older faculty to consider retirement." "Encouraging them to retire because of their age?" "Not just because of their age, but because of the benefits that come with having a younger faculty." The damage was done. Patterson had essentially admitted that age was a factor in the university's personnel decisions, contradicting the institution's claims that Martha's treatment was based solely on performance concerns. The university's defense centered on their contention that Martha's effectiveness had declined and that their concerns were legitimate educational issues rather than age discrimination. They called several witnesses to support this narrative. Dr. Kevin Walsh, a recently hired assistant professor in his early 30s, testified that he had observed Martha struggling with technology in faculty meetings, and that some students had complained about her old-fashioned teaching methods. "I had several students tell me that Professor Kellerman's classes felt outdated," Walsh testified. "They said she relied too heavily on traditional lecture formats and didn't incorporate enough interactive elements." But Rebecca Daniels' cross-examination revealed the weakness in Walsh's testimony. "Dr. Walsh, did you ever observe one of Professor Kellerman's classes directly?" "No, I did not." "So your testimony about her teaching methods is based entirely on second-hand reports?" "Yes, but the reports were consistent." "Did you ever speak to Professor Kellerman directly about these alleged concerns?" "No, I thought it would be inappropriate." "Did you review her student evaluations or teaching assessments?" "No, I didn't have access to those materials." Rebecca's questioning revealed that Walsh's testimony was based on rumors and assumptions rather than direct observation or documented evidence. The most damaging testimony for the university came from an unexpected source. Dr. Brian Michaels, the associate dean who had initially supported the effort to pressure Martha into retirement, had experienced a change of heart after witnessing the broader pattern of discrimination. "I participated in discussions about Professor Kellerman's future because I believed we were addressing legitimate performance concerns," Michaels testified. "But as I learned more about how other older faculty members had been treated, I realized that age was the primary factor in these decisions." Michaels' testimony was devastating because it came from within the university administration. He described meetings where older faculty members were discussed in terms of their age rather than their performance, where the goal was explicitly to refresh the faculty by encouraging retirements. I came to understand that we weren't evaluating Professor Kellerman's actual effectiveness, he said. We were making assumptions about her capabilities based on her age, and that was wrong. The university's attorneys attempted to discredit Michaels by suggesting that he was seeking to protect himself from potential legal liability. But his testimony was corroborated by notes from faculty meetings and email exchanges that supported his account of the decision-making process. Martha's own testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the trial. She took the stand on the fourth day, wearing a navy blue dress that conveyed both professionalism and dignity. Her voice was steady as she described her career, her passion for teaching, and her refusal to be pushed aside because of her age. I didn't fight this battle because I couldn't accept retirement, she testified. I fought it because I believe that older workers deserve to be judged on their performance, not their age. I was still an effective teacher, I was still passionate about my work, and I still had contributions to make. Martha's testimony was powerful because it was deeply personal. She spoke about the humiliation of being told she was past her prime, the isolation she experienced after filing her complaint, and the pain of watching her life's work being dismissed as irrelevant. They didn't see a professor with 47 years of experience, she said. They saw a 71-year-old woman who was taking up space that could be filled by someone younger. That's not just wrong, it's illegal. The cross-examination was intense. Matthews questioned Martha about her technology skills, her teaching methods, and her ability to connect with modern students. But Martha was prepared for every line of attack. I've adapted to every technological change the university has implemented, she said firmly. I use online learning platforms. I incorporate multimedia into my presentations. I communicate with students through social media and email. Age doesn't prevent someone from learning new skills. When Matthews suggested that her teaching methods were outdated, Martha responded with passion. I combine traditional literary analysis with contemporary applications. I help students understand how classic texts relate to modern issues. Experience doesn't make someone less effective, it makes them more effective. The closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon, with both sides summarizing their cases for the jury. Matthews argued that the university had acted within its rights as an employer, making difficult but necessary decisions about faculty composition and institutional needs. This case isn't about age discrimination, he concluded. It's about an institution's right to make personnel decisions based on educational effectiveness and student needs. Northern Arizona University treated Dr. Kellerman with respect and offered her a dignified exit from her career. The fact that she chose to fight that decision doesn't make it discriminatory. Rebecca Daniels' closing argument was passionate and direct. Members of the jury, the evidence has shown you a clear pattern of age discrimination that affected Martha Kellerman and numerous other faculty members. The university's own documents prove that age was a factor in their decisions. Martha Kellerman was not failing as a teacher, she was failing to be young enough to fit their vision of the future. As the jury retired for deliberation, Martha felt a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. She had told her story, presented her evidence, and made her case. Now 12 strangers would decide whether her fight had been worth it, whether her voice still mattered, whether older workers deserved protection from discrimination. The waiting would be the hardest part of all. The jury deliberated for 18 hours across 3 days. Martha spent those endless hours in a small conference room adjacent to the courthouse, alternating between nervous pacing and forced attempts at reading. Rebecca Daniels had warned her that lengthy deliberations could mean anything: thorough consideration of complex evidence, disagreement among jurors, or careful review of damages calculations. On Tuesday morning, March 23rd, the call came at 9:47 a.m. The jury had reached a verdict. Martha's hands trembled as she straightened her jacket and walked back into the courtroom that had become the center of her universe for the past 2 weeks. The gallery was packed with supporters, media representatives, and university officials. She noticed several of her former colleagues in attendance, their faces carefully neutral as they awaited the outcome that could reshape academic employment practices across the country. Judge Morrison entered precisely at 10 o'clock, her expression revealing nothing, as she took her seat. Has the jury reached a verdict? The jury foreman, a 58-year-old construction supervisor named Robert Chen, stood with a single sheet of paper in his hands. We have, Your Honor. Please hand the verdict to the bailiff. The moments that followed felt like hours. Judge Morrison reviewed the verdict silently, her face maintaining its professional mask. Finally, she looked up. Will the defendant please rise? Martha stood on unsteady legs, Rebecca Daniels beside her, both women barely breathing as they waited for the words that would determine everything. In the matter of Kellerman versus Northern Arizona University, on the count of age discrimination in violation of the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, we, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Martha Kellerman. The courtroom erupted. Martha felt her knees buckle slightly, and Rebecca's steadying hand on her arm was the only thing that kept her upright. Behind them, she could hear gasps, whispered conversations, and the rapid clicking of camera shutters. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. On the matter of damages, the jury awards the plaintiff back pay in the amount of $127,000, representing lost wages from the time of constructive dismissal through the present. The jury further awards front pay in the amount of $240,000, representing projected future earnings, through Professor Kellerman's intended retirement at age 78. Martha's mind struggled to process the numbers. The financial award was substantial, but more important was what it represented. Validation that her fight had been justified, recognition that age discrimination was real and costly. Additionally, Judge Morrison continued, the jury awards punitive damages in the amount of $500,000, finding that the defendant's conduct was willful and egregious. The total award of $67,000 sent shockwaves through the academic community. It was one of the largest age discrimination settlements in higher education history. But more significantly, it established a precedent that would protect older faculty members nationwide. Judge Morrison wasn't finished. The court further orders that the defendant shall offer Professor Kellerman immediate reinstatement to her previous position with full teaching load and responsibilities, should she choose to accept such reinstatement. As the judge's gavel fell, Martha found herself surrounded by well-wishers, reporters, and legal colleagues. The victory was overwhelming, but she knew the real work was just beginning. The university's response was swift and predictable. Within hours of the verdict, Northern Arizona University issued a statement expressing disappointment with the jury's decision and announcing their intention to appeal. University President, Dr. Margaret Foster, appeared at a hastily arranged press conference, flanked by attorneys and public relations specialists. While we respect the jury's decision, we believe it mischaracterizes the university's actions and motivations, Foster said, reading from a prepared statement. Northern Arizona University has always been committed to diversity and inclusion, and we will continue to fight these allegations through the appellate process. But the damage to the university's reputation was already evident. Within 24 hours of the verdict, the Arizona Republic published an editorial calling for President Foster's resignation. Alumni groups organized petitions demanding changes in university leadership. The Faculty Senate passed a resolution of no confidence in the administration. More importantly, older faculty members across the country began coming forward with their own stories of age discrimination. Martha's victory had opened a floodgate of complaints and lawsuits that would transform academic employment practices. 3 weeks after the verdict, Martha received a formal letter from the university offering her reinstatement. The tone was stiffly professional, lacking any acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but the offer was genuine: full restoration of her teaching position, back pay, and a promise of no retaliation. Martha spent days considering the offer. At 73, she had already proven her point and secured her financial future. She could accept the monetary award and walk away, knowing she had struck a blow for older workers everywhere. But that wasn't who Martha Kellerman was. On a bright April morning, she walked back onto the Northern Arizona University campus for the first time in over a year. Students passing by did double takes, recognizing her from the extensive media coverage. Some approached with words of support and congratulation. "Professor Kellerman, I'm Jake Morrison. I was supposed to take your Victorian literature class last year, but it got canceled. Will you be teaching it again?" Martha smiled at the earnest young man with sandy hair and eager eyes. "I'll be teaching it this fall, Jake. I hope you'll consider enrolling." The English department offices were awkwardly quiet when Martha arrived. Some colleagues greeted her warmly, others offered stilted congratulations, and a few simply avoided eye contact altogether. The dynamics had clearly shifted during her absence. Department Chair Bradley Hutchins was notably absent, having resigned 2 weeks after the verdict. His replacement was Dr. Lisa Martinez, a respected scholar in her 50s, who had publicly supported Martha throughout the legal proceedings. "Martha, welcome back," Dr. Martinez said, embracing her warmly. "Your office is exactly as you left it. We've been looking forward to your return." Martha's office had indeed been preserved, her books and papers carefully maintained by the staff. Sitting behind her familiar desk, she felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. The fight had been necessary, but it had come at a cost. Relationships strained, trust broken, an academic community divided. Her first faculty meeting back was tense but civil. Martha spoke briefly about her hope that the department could move forward constructively, focusing on their shared commitment to education rather than the conflicts of the past year. "I didn't fight this battle for revenge," she told her colleagues. "I fought it because I believe in the principle that all faculty members should be judged on their merit, not their age. I hope we can use this experience to become a stronger, more inclusive department." The fall semester brought new challenges and new opportunities. Martha's Victorian literature class filled within hours of registration opening, with a waiting list of over 30 students. Many enrolled, not just for the subject matter, but because they wanted to learn from the professor who had become a symbol of resistance against discrimination. Her first day back in the classroom was emotional. As Martha looked out at the faces of her students, some eager, some curious, some skeptical, she felt the familiar rush of energy that had sustained her through 47 years of teaching. "Literature," she began, her voice strong and clear, "is about understanding the human experience across time and cultures. The authors will study this semester and write about issues that remain relevant today: social justice, individual rights, the struggle against institutional oppression." A student in the front row raised her hand. "Professor Kellerman, do you think your own experience with discrimination gives you a different perspective on the literature we'll be reading?" Martha paused, considering the question carefully. "I think my experience has reminded me that the fight for justice is ongoing, that every generation must stand up against prejudice and inequality. The authors we'll study, Dickens, Gaskell, Hardy, were writing about similar struggles in their own time." The semester progressed smoothly, with Martha's teaching evaluations remaining consistently high. Her research productivity actually increased, as if the legal victory had reinvigorated her scholarly passion. She began work on a book about age discrimination in academia, drawing on her own experience and the broader patterns revealed during the trial. The university's appeal was unsuccessful. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the jury verdict in a strongly worded opinion that praised the lower court's handling of the case and emphasized the importance of protecting older workers from discrimination. The evidence in this case reveals a systematic pattern of age-based discrimination that violated both the letter and spirit of federal employment law. The appellate court wrote, "Institutions of higher education are not exempt from their obligations to treat all employees fairly, regardless of age." The Supreme Court declined to hear the university's final appeal, letting the verdict stand and establishing Martha's case as binding precedent in federal courts across the western United States. As news of the final legal victory spread, Martha found herself inundated with speaking requests from universities, legal organizations, and advocacy groups. She began traveling on weekends, sharing her story and encouraging other older workers to stand up for their rights. At a conference of the American Association of University Professors, Martha delivered a keynote address that brought the audience to its feet. "Age discrimination thrives in silence," she told the crowd of academics. It depends on our willingness to accept that reaching a certain birthday somehow diminishes our value or our contributions. But experience is not a liability. It's an asset that should be treasured, not discarded. The speech was recorded and shared widely on social media, inspiring older workers in industries far beyond academia. Martha began receiving letters from teachers, engineers, nurses, and business professionals who had faced similar discrimination and found courage in her example. One letter particularly moved her. It came from Dr. Elizabeth Warren Thompson, a 68-year-old physician who had been pressured to retire from a major hospital system in California. "Your victory gave me the strength to fight back," Dr. Thompson wrote. "I filed my own age discrimination complaint and just received a settlement that will allow me to continue practicing medicine for as long as I choose. Thank you for showing us that we don't have to go quietly into the night." Martha's impact extended beyond individual cases. Universities across the country began reviewing their retirement policies and faculty development programs. The Association of American Universities issued new guidelines for addressing age diversity in academic hiring and retention. Several states passed legislation strengthening protections for older workers, with many citing Martha's case as inspiration for the new laws. The Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission updated its enforcement guidelines to specifically address the tactics that had been used against Martha and other older faculty members. 3 years after her victory, Martha was invited to the White House for the signing of the Senior Workers Protection Act, legislation that expanded federal protections against age discrimination and increased penalties for violations. Standing in the Rose Garden beside the president, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. "This law represents more than legal protection," the president said during the signing ceremony. "It represents a recognition that wisdom and experience are national treasures that should be valued, not wasted." Martha's teaching career continued to flourish. At 76, she was promoted to Distinguished Professor, the university's highest academic honor. Her research on age discrimination became a standard text in employment law courses, and her Victorian literature classes remained among the most popular in the English department. Students who had graduated years earlier would return to campus specifically to visit Martha's office, sharing stories of how her classes had influenced their careers and lives. Many spoke of learning more than just literature. They had learned about resilience, principle, and the importance of standing up for what's right. On a spring afternoon in 2025, Martha sat in her office, grading final exams from her Contemporary Applications of Victorian Literature course. At 78, she was finally ready to retire, but on her own terms and at her own pace. Her decision to step down was met with genuine sadness from students and colleagues alike. The university announced plans to establish the Martha Kellerman Center for Faculty Development, focusing on supporting educators throughout their careers and combating age discrimination in higher education. At her retirement celebration, attended by hundreds of former students, colleagues, and legal professionals, Martha reflected on the unexpected turn her career had taken. What had begun as a fight to keep her job had evolved into a movement that protected older workers nationwide. "I never intended to become an activist," she told the gathering. "I just wanted to keep teaching." But sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone who faces the same challenges. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the former student who had become a successful novelist, served as the evening's keynote speaker. "Professor Kellerman taught me that literature reflects life, and life reflects our choices," Rodriguez said. Her choice to fight discrimination didn't just change her own life, it changed the lives of countless older workers who refused to be dismissed because of their age. As Martha cleaned out her office for the final time, she found the letter from Elena that had sustained her during the darkest moments of her legal battle. The words still resonated. "You taught me that age brings wisdom, not irrelevance." She carefully packed the letter with her other treasures: photos of students, thank you notes from colleagues, copies of her published research, and the framed copy of the jury verdict that had validated her fight. Walking across campus on her final day as a professor, Martha encountered Jake Morrison, the student who had approached her on her first day back after the trial. Now a graduate student in the English department, He was working on his thesis about social justice themes in Victorian literature. Professor Kellerman, I wanted to thank you one more time, Jake said. Your class changed my entire academic focus. I'm planning to become a professor myself, and I hope I can inspire students the way you inspired me. Martha smiled, remembering her own early days as a young teacher with dreams of changing the world through education. Jake, the most important thing I can tell you is this: never let anyone convince you that you don't matter because of your age, your background, or any other characteristic that has nothing to do with your abilities. Your voice matters at every stage of your career. As Martha drove away from Northern Arizona University for the last time as a faculty member, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had proven that age was just a number, that experience was valuable, and that standing up for principle could create lasting change. Her fight had begun with a simple refusal to be pushed aside. It had ended with a transformation of how society viewed older workers and their contributions. Martha Kellerman had indeed proven how much she mattered, not just to her students and colleagues, but to generations of older Americans who would benefit from the precedent she had set. The little house on the outskirts of Flagstaff was quiet as Martha settled into her chair, with a cup of tea and the evening newspaper. The front-page story was about a group of older teachers in Texas who had successfully challenged mandatory retirement policies, citing Martha's case as their inspiration. She smiled and turned to the book review section, already planning her next project, a memoir about the fight that had defined her final years in academia. She had a story to tell, and at 78, Martha Kellerman still had plenty of wisdom left to share with the world. 10 years had passed since Martha Kellerman walked away from Northern Arizona University for the last time, as a professor. The desert landscape around Flagstaff remained unchanged, but the world of higher education had been transformed by the precedent she had set. At 88, Martha moved carefully but with purpose through her spacious new home in Scottsdale, where she had relocated to be closer to her daughter Sarah and her grandchildren. The Martha Kellerman Center for Faculty Development had become a cornerstone of Northern Arizona University's reputation. What began as a symbolic gesture had evolved into a nationally recognized program that other universities studied and replicated. Maria Santos, the center's director, regularly consulted with Martha on new initiatives and research projects. Martha, I wanted to share the latest statistics with you, Dr. Santos said during one of their monthly video calls. Age discrimination complaints in higher education have dropped by 67% since 2010. Universities are proactively implementing policies to protect older faculty, and many are actively recruiting experienced educators who might have been overlooked in the past. Martha adjusted her reading glasses and smiled at the computer screen. Technology that had once been used as evidence of her supposed incompetence now connected her to colleagues and advocates worldwide. That's wonderful news, Maria. But tell me about the individual stories. Numbers are important, but people matter more. Dr. Santos pulled up a file on her computer. We've tracked over 400 cases where older faculty members successfully challenged discriminatory practices, all citing your case as precedent. But more importantly, we're seeing cultural changes. Departments are recognizing that age diversity strengthens their programs. The conversation turned to a recent development that had brought Martha particular satisfaction. Dr. Bradley Hutchins, her former department chair who had initiated the campaign to force her retirement, had applied for a position at a small college in Oregon. At 65, he found himself facing the same ageist assumptions he had once directed at others. He reached out to me last month, Martha told Dr. Santos. He wanted to apologize and to ask for advice on handling age discrimination he was experiencing. The phone call with Hutchins had been awkward but meaningful. He had struggled to find work after leaving Northern Arizona University, discovering that his reputation had been damaged by his role in Martha's case. More troubling for him was the realization that his own age was now being used against him. Martha, I owe you an apology, he had said, his voice heavy with regret. I didn't understand what I was putting you through. I thought I was making reasonable business decisions, but I was perpetuating discrimination. I'm sorry. Martha had listened without interruption. remembering the hurt and frustration she had felt during those difficult months when Hutchins was pressuring her to retire. But time and perspective had softened her anger. "Bradley, I appreciate your apology," she had replied. "What matters now is what we do with the lessons we've learned. Use your experience to help others, and make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The ripple effects of Martha's victory extended far beyond academia. The legal precedent had been cited in hundreds of age discrimination cases across various industries. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission had strengthened its enforcement guidelines, and several states had passed legislation specifically addressing the tactics that had been used against Martha. One of the most significant developments was the emergence of the Gray Wave movement, a grassroots organization of older workers who refused to be pushed aside. Martha had been invited to serve as an honorary chair, though she had declined a more active role due to her age and desire to spend time with family. The movement's annual conference had grown from a small gathering of 50 people to a major event attracting thousands of participants. This year's conference was being held in Phoenix, just an hour from Martha's home. Despite her usual reluctance to travel, she had agreed to deliver the closing keynote address. The Phoenix Convention Center buzzed with energy as Martha arrived on a warm October morning. The attendees ranged in age from their 50s to their 90s, representing every profession imaginable. She noticed teachers, nurses, engineers, artists, business executives, and countless others who had faced discrimination based on their age. "Mrs. Kellerman, you probably don't remember me, but I was one of your students in 2019, said a woman approaching Martha in the lobby. "I'm Dr. Jennifer Walsh now. Your Victorian literature class inspired me to pursue my PhD in English, and I'm now teaching at Arizona State University." Martha studied the young woman's face, the memory gradually returning. "Jennifer, of course. You wrote a brilliant paper on social justice themes in hard times. I'm so proud of what you've accomplished. I wanted to thank you for more than just the academic inspiration." Jennifer continued. "Watching you fight for your right to continue teaching showed me that standing up for principle matters more than avoiding conflict. That lesson has guided my entire career." Similar encounters filled Martha's morning as she moved through the conference. Former students, fellow educators, and workers from various fields approached to share their stories of how her case had influenced their lives and careers. The keynote session was held in the main ballroom, with over 2,000 people in attendance. As Martha was introduced, the audience rose in a sustained standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. She stood at the podium, overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment. "10 years ago, I thought I was simply fighting to keep my job," she began, her voice still strong despite her advanced age. "I had no idea that my personal battle would become part of a larger movement to transform how our society views older workers." Martha spoke about the changes she had witnessed, the legislation that had been passed, and the cultural shifts that were making workplaces more inclusive. But she also addressed the challenges that remain. "We've made tremendous progress, but discrimination doesn't disappear overnight. It evolves, becomes more subtle, finds new ways to exclude and marginalize. We must remain vigilant, continue speaking out, and support each other in this ongoing fight." She shared stories from the letters she continued to receive. A 60-year-old nurse who had been forced out during hospital restructuring. A 55-year-old engineer who had been passed over for promotions in favor of younger colleagues, a 70-year-old teacher who had been told she was out of touch with modern students. Each of these stories represents a person whose experience and wisdom are being wasted, Martha said, but they also represent opportunities for us to intervene, to advocate, and to ensure that age becomes an asset rather than a liability. The most powerful part of her speech came when she addressed the audience directly about their own roles in creating change. "You are not just victims of discrimination," she said, her voice rising with passion. "You are agents of transformation. Every time you refuse to accept ageist assumptions, every time you challenge discriminatory practices, every time you support a colleague facing age bias, you are continuing the work that we began together." Martha concluded her remarks with a reflection on legacy and purpose that brought many in the audience to tears. "I've been asked many times whether I regret the fight I undertook. whether the stress and uncertainty were worth it. The answer is unequivocally yes. Not because of the personal vindication, but because of what we accomplished together. We proved that age discrimination is not inevitable, that older workers have value, and that standing up for principle can create lasting change. As the conference ended, Martha felt a deep sense of completion. She had seen her individual fight evolve into a movement that was transforming workplaces across the country. The young people who had doubted her relevance 10 years earlier were now middle-aged workers who would benefit from the protections she had helped establish. The drive back to Scottsdale took Martha through familiar desert landscape, past the exit for Flagstaff where her long career had unfolded. She thought about the circuitous path that had led her from a young English teacher to a national symbol of resistance against age discrimination. At home, she found her grandson David waiting with his laptop, ready to help her with her latest project. At 25, David was a journalist who had grown up hearing stories about his grandmother's famous legal battle. He had proposed writing a book about the broader implications of her case, and Martha had agreed to collaborate. "Grandma, I've been researching the legislative changes that followed your case," David said, pulling up files on his computer. "Did you know that 12 states have passed laws strengthening age discrimination protections, and all of them specifically reference your case in their legislative history?" Martha settled into her favorite chair, accepting the cup of tea that David had prepared. "I knew about some of them. But 12 states? That's remarkable. There's more," David continued, his excitement evident. "The Department of Labor just released a study showing that companies with age-diverse workforces are more innovative and profitable than those that skew younger. They're calling it the Kellerman effect." The term made Martha chuckle. She had never sought fame or recognition, but she was pleased that her name had become associated with positive change, rather than just legal conflict. As they worked on the book outline, Martha reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken. She had planned to retire quietly, perhaps travel with her late husband, tend her garden, and enjoy her grandchildren. Instead, she had become a reluctant activist, whose story continued to inspire others. "David, I want to make sure the book emphasizes that this isn't just about my story," she said. "It's about the thousands of older workers who face discrimination every day, and the countless people who found the courage to stand up because they knew they weren't alone." The book project would be Martha's final major contribution to the movement she had helped create. She was determined to document not just her own experience, but the broader changes that had resulted from her decision to fight rather than quietly retire. 3 months later, on a crisp January morning, Martha received a phone call that brought her story full circle. President Sarah Chen of Northern Arizona University was calling to invite her to a special ceremony. "Professor Kellerman, we would be honored if you would accept our invitation to receive an honorary doctorate and to deliver our commencement address this spring." President Chen said, "We want to recognize your contributions to education and your role in advancing faculty rights." Martha was quiet for a long moment, considering the irony of being honored by the same institution that had tried to force her out. But she also recognized the gesture as evidence of how much had changed. "I would be honored to accept," she said finally, "but I have one request. I'd like to dedicate the ceremony to all the older workers who have faced discrimination and found the courage to fight back." The commencement ceremony took place on a beautiful May morning, with Martha wearing the traditional academic regalia that had been part of her professional identity for so many decades. As she approached the podium to address the graduating class, she saw familiar faces in the audience, former colleagues, students, and supporters who had followed her journey. "Class of 2035, she began. "You are entering a workforce that is more inclusive and more respectful of all workers than the one I encountered 50 years ago." But that progress didn't happen automatically. It happened because people refused to accept discrimination, because they stood up for their principles, and because they believed that change was possible. Martha's final public speech was a call to action for the young graduates, encouraging them to carry forward the values of inclusion and respect that had become central to her legacy. "Don't wait until you're older to stand up against age discrimination," she told them. "Start now, in your first jobs, by treating colleagues of all ages with respect and recognizing the value of experience alongside the energy of youth. As she concluded her remarks and received her honorary doctorate, Martha felt a profound sense of closure. The fight that had begun with a simple refusal to be pushed aside had evolved into a movement that would protect future generations of workers. Later that evening, at a quiet family dinner, Martha's daughter Sarah raised a toast to her mother's remarkable journey. To Mom, who taught us that it's never too late to stand up for what's right, and that one person's courage can change the world. Martha smiled, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, knowing that her most important legacy wasn't the legal precedent or the legislative changes, but the example she had set for her family and for countless others who refused to be silenced by age. At 88, Martha Kellerman could look back on a life well lived and a fight well fought. She had proven beyond any doubt that she truly mattered, not just to her students and colleagues, but to generations of workers who would benefit from the courage she had shown in standing up to discrimination. The little girl who had once dreamed of becoming a teacher had not only educated thousands of students, but had also taught an entire society a vital lesson about respect, dignity, and the enduring value of human experience. Her voice, which some had tried to silence, had ultimately become one of the most important of her generation. 6 months after the commencement ceremony, Martha received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Amanda Foster, her former student who had testified during the trial, arrived at Martha's home carrying a thick manuscript and wearing a nervous smile. "Professor Kellerman, I hope you don't mind the surprise visit," Amanda said as Martha welcomed her into the living room. "I've been working on something for the past 3 years, and I wanted to share it with you before anyone else sees it." The manuscript was titled The Kellerman Doctrine: How One Professor's Fight Transformed American Workplace Law. Amanda had spent years researching the broader implications of Martha's case, interviewing legal experts, policymakers, and workers whose lives had been touched by the precedent. "Amanda, this is extraordinary work," Martha said, carefully turning the pages. "But why bring it to me? You don't need my approval to publish scholarly research. Actually, I do need something from you," Amanda replied. "I want you to write the foreword. Your voice needs to introduce this story, because without your courage, none of these changes would have happened." As Martha read through Amanda's meticulous research, she was amazed by the scope of change that had occurred. The ripple effects extended far beyond what she had imagined. Amanda had documented how Martha's case had influenced international labor law, with countries like Canada, Australia, and several European nations strengthening their own age discrimination protections. "Look at this section about corporate America," Amanda said, pointing to a chapter titled The Business Case for Age Inclusion. "Fortune 500 companies have completely restructured their hiring and retention practices. They're actively recruiting older workers because research shows that age-diverse teams outperform homogeneous ones." The data was compelling. Companies with significant numbers of workers over 50 reported higher customer satisfaction, lower turnover rates, and increased innovation. The stereotype of older workers being resistant to change had been thoroughly debunked by empirical evidence. Martha was particularly moved by a section about international recognition. The United Nations had cited her case in a resolution calling for global action against age discrimination. The International Labor Organization had developed new guidelines for protecting older workers, using the legal framework established by her victory. "There's something else," Amanda said, her voice taking on a more personal tone. "I've been invited to present this research at the Global Summit on Aging and Employment in Geneva next month. They've specifically requested that you accompany me as the keynote speaker." The invitation represented the international recognition of Martha's impact, but it also presented a dilemma. At 88, international travel was challenging, and Martha had been limiting her public appearances. "I appreciate the honor, Amanda, but I'm not sure I'm up for international travel at my age," Martha said carefully. "I understand completely," Amanda replied, "but I should mention that they've arranged for a delegation of older workers from around the world to attend specifically to meet you. There's a woman from Japan who fought mandatory retirement policies," a man from Brazil who challenged age bias in technology companies, and dozens of others who drew inspiration from your story. The thought of meeting these international advocates intrigued Martha. Her story had somehow transcended national boundaries and cultural differences, speaking to a universal human experience of aging in the workplace. After much consideration and discussion with her family, Martha agreed to make the trip. The journey to Geneva was her first international travel in over a decade, but the warmth of her reception made every discomfort worthwhile. The global summit brought together labor activists, policymakers, researchers, and older workers from 47 countries. Martha was astonished to discover that her case had been translated into dozens of languages and studied by advocates worldwide. Mrs. Kellerman, in my country, we call you the grandmother of workplace rights, said Kenji Nakamura, a 70-year-old engineer from Tokyo who had successfully challenged Japan's traditional mandatory retirement system. Your courage gave us the framework to fight our own battles. Similar stories emerged throughout the conference. In Brazil, a group of technology workers had formed the Kellerman Coalition to combat age discrimination in the rapidly evolving tech sector. In Germany, older educators had lobbied for legislation protecting academic freedom regardless of age, citing Martha's case as precedent. During her keynote address to the international audience, Martha reflected on the unexpected global reach of her personal struggle. When I walked up those courthouse steps in Flagstaff 10 years ago, I thought I was fighting for my own right to continue teaching, she said, speaking through simultaneous translation to delegates from around the world. I never imagined that my story would become part of a global movement for workplace equality. She spoke about the universal nature of aging and the common challenges faced by older workers regardless of their nationality or culture. The discrimination she had experienced in Arizona was being replicated in boardrooms in Tokyo, factories in Manchester, and offices in São Paulo. Age discrimination is not an American problem or a European problem or an Asian problem. Martha said, it's a human problem that requires a global solution. We must work together across borders and cultures to ensure that experience is valued, not discarded. The conference concluded with the adoption of the Geneva Declaration on Age Inclusion, a non-binding but symbolically important document that outlined principles for protecting older workers globally. Martha was invited to be the first signatory, her signature representing the grassroots origins of what had become an international movement. Returning to Arizona, Martha found herself energized by the international connections she had made. She began corresponding regularly with advocates worldwide, sharing strategies and offering encouragement to those facing their own battles against age discrimination. Her collaboration with grandson David on their book project took on new dimensions as they incorporated the international perspective she had gained. The book, tentatively titled Beyond Retirement: The Global Fight for Age Equality, would document not just Martha's personal journey, but the worldwide movement it had inspired. Grandma, I think we need to expand our scope, David said during one of their working sessions. This isn't just about American workplace law anymore. It's about a fundamental shift in how humanity views aging and productivity. Martha agreed, and they began reaching out to the international contacts she had made in Geneva. The book would feature stories from older workers on every continent, showing how the principles established in her case had been adapted to different cultural and legal contexts. As winter approached, Martha received news that brought her story full circle in an unexpected way. Northern Arizona University had established an exchange program with universities worldwide, bringing international scholars to study age discrimination and workplace inclusion. The program was housed in the Martha Kellerman Center and had attracted researchers from over 20 countries. Professor Kellerman, we'd like to invite you to participate in our inaugural International Symposium on Age and Academic Excellence, said Dr. Santos during one of their regular calls. We have scholars coming from universities in 12 countries, all studying the impact of your case on their own institutional policies. The symposium represented something Martha had never envisioned, her personal fight becoming the subject of academic study and international scholarly exchange. Researchers were analyzing the legal strategies, documenting the social changes, and developing theoretical frameworks based on her experience. Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka from the University of Tokyo presented research showing how Martha's case had influenced Japan's recent reforms to academic employment practices. Dr. Isabella Rossi from the University of Bologna discussed how Italian universities had adopted new policies protecting older faculty members, directly citing Martha's precedent. "What fascinates me about the Kellerman case," Dr. Rossi said during her presentation, "is how it transcended legal boundaries to become a cultural touchstone. It's not just cited in employment law, it appears in sociology research, business management studies, and even philosophical discussions about the nature of human value." The most moving presentation came from Dr. Sarah O'Brien from University College Dublin, who had been forced into early retirement at 63, but had successfully fought back using strategies derived from Martha's case. "I want to speak directly to Professor Kellerman," Dr. O'Brien said, looking toward Martha in the audience. "Your courage didn't just change American law, it gave older academics worldwide the roadmap and the confidence to fight for their rights. I'm back in my classroom today because you showed us that resistance was possible." As the symposium concluded, Martha found herself surrounded by researchers eager to discuss their work and share their own experiences with age discrimination. The conversation continued long into the evening, with scholars from different continents comparing notes on strategies, sharing success stories, and planning collaborative research projects. One conversation particularly struck Martha. Dr. Elena Petrov from Moscow State University described how Russian academics had formed underground networks to support older faculty facing pressure to retire. They called themselves Kellerman Circles and met secretly to share resources and coordinate resistance efforts. "Your story travels in ways you never intended," Dr. Petrov explained. "It gives people hope when they feel powerless, and it provides practical guidance for those ready to fight." That evening, alone in her hotel room, Martha reflected on the extraordinary journey her life had taken. What began as a simple desire to continue teaching had evolved into a global movement that was reshaping how societies viewed aging and work. She thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by her decision to stand up rather than step aside. Students who had benefited from the experience of older teachers, workers who had kept their jobs because of strengthened legal protections, and advocates around the world who had found courage in her example. The next morning brought another surprise. A delegation of current Northern Arizona University students, led by the Student Government Association president, requested a meeting with Martha. "Professor Kellerman, we wanted to thank you for something that might not be obvious," said Jessica Chen, a senior majoring in education. "Because of the changes your case brought about, we've had access to some incredible older faculty members who might have been forced out under the old system." Jessica went on to describe professors in their 70s and 80s, who were among the most popular and effective teachers on campus. These educators brought historical perspective, institutional memory, and hard-earned wisdom that enriched the academic experience for students. "You didn't just fight for your own right to teach," Jessica continued. "You fought for our right to learn from the most experienced educators. Our education is richer because of what you did." The students presented Martha with a petition signed by over 3,000 current and former students, expressing gratitude for her role in preserving age diversity in academia. The document would be permanently displayed in the Martha Kellerman Center as a reminder of the educational benefits of combating age discrimination. As Martha prepared to return home to Scottsdale, she felt a profound sense of completion. Her personal battle had become something much larger, a global movement that continued to grow and evolve. The change she had initiated would outlast her own lifetime, protecting future generations of older workers around the world. The drive back through the Arizona desert gave Martha time to process the overwhelming experiences of the past few days. She thought about the young teacher she had once been, full of dreams and determination. That woman could never have imagined the path her life would take or the impact her decisions would have on people she would never meet. But perhaps that was the most important lesson of all. Every act of courage, every stand for principle, every refusal to accept injustice had the potential to create ripples that spread far beyond their origins. Martha had proven that one person's voice really could change the world. One case at a time, one law at a time, one life at a time. Her story was no longer just her own, it belonged to every older worker who refused to be diminished by age, every advocate who fought for equality, and every person who believed that experience and wisdom were treasures to be valued, not burdens to be discarded. Back in Scottsdale, Martha discovered that her international visibility had attracted the attention of documentary filmmakers, journalists, and even Hollywood producers interested in telling her story. The offers arrived daily: movie rights, television specials, podcast series, and streaming documentaries, all seeking to capitalize on what one producer called the most inspiring workplace rights story of the 21st century. Grandma, Steven Spielberg's production company, wants to option your life story, David announced one morning, holding up a formal contract offer. They're talking about Helen Mirren or Meryl Streep to play you. The advance alone would set up college funds for all your great-grandchildren. Martha examined the contract with the same careful attention she had once given to student papers. The financial terms were staggering, but she was more concerned about how her story would be portrayed. "David, I'm not interested in being turned into some Hollywood hero," she said firmly. "My fight wasn't about personal glory, it was about systemic change. If we're going to tell this story, it needs to be authentic and educational, not entertainment." Instead of the Hollywood option, Martha chose to work with a documentary team from PBS that had produced acclaimed films about social justice movements. Director Michael Torres, no relation to her former colleague, had a reputation for nuanced storytelling that prioritized truth over drama. The documentary process took 18 months and involved extensive interviews with key figures from Martha's case. Former students, colleagues, legal experts, and international advocates all contributed their perspectives on how her fight had influenced their own lives and work. One of the most powerful segments featured a reunion between Martha and several faculty members who had been pressured to retire around the same time. Dr. Patricia Williams from the psychology department, Professor Robert Chang from the economics department, and Dr. Linda Foster from the chemistry department had all faced similar discrimination but had chosen different responses. "I took the buyout," Dr. Williams admitted during the filmed interview. "I was tired of fighting, and I thought maybe they were right, maybe it was time to step aside. Watching Martha's victory made me realize I gave up too easily." Professor Chang had a different story. "Martha's case gave me the courage to file my own complaint. I was able to teach for 3 more years before retiring on my own terms. Those were some of the most fulfilling years of my career." The documentary also explored the psychological and social costs of age discrimination that extended beyond individual cases. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a gerontologist at the University of Southern California, explained how forced retirement and workplace ageism contributed to depression, cognitive decline, and early mortality among older adults. Martha Kellerman's fight wasn't just about employment law, Dr. Martinez said in her interview. It was about human dignity and the right to remain productive and valued throughout one's lifespan. The health implications of age discrimination are profound and often overlooked. The film included segments about Martha's international impact, featuring interviews with advocates from 6 different countries. The most moving sequence showed Kenji Nakamura in Tokyo, leading a support group for older workers facing discrimination in Japan's traditionally age-hierarchical corporate culture. "Before learning about Professor Kellerman, we accepted mandatory retirement as cultural tradition," Nakamura explained to the camera. Her example showed us that tradition can be challenged when it becomes injustice. As the documentary neared completion, Martha was invited to preview the final cut. Watching her life unfold on screen was surreal and emotional. She saw herself as others saw her, not just as a determined professor, but as a catalyst for global change. The film premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, where it received a standing ovation and won the Documentary Audience Award. But for Martha, the more meaningful recognition came from the flood of letters and emails that followed the PBS broadcast. A retired nurse from Maine wrote, "Your documentary gave me the courage to report the age discrimination I faced at my hospital. Because of your example, I filed a complaint and won a settlement that allowed me to return to work. A teacher from Ohio shared, I was about to accept early retirement rather than fight the subtle pressure from my principal. After watching your story, I decided to stand my ground. I'm still teaching and loving every minute of it. An engineer from California revealed, your case inspired me to start a consulting firm specifically for older technical professionals. We're proving that experience and wisdom are valuable commodities in the modern economy. The documentary's success led to another unexpected opportunity. The Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History reached out to Martha about donating artifacts from her case for a permanent exhibition on workplace rights in America. Professor Kellerman, your legal battle represents a pivotal moment in American labor history, explained Dr. Jennifer Park, the museum's curator of social movements. We'd like to display items from your case alongside artifacts from other landmark employment rights struggles. Martha spent weeks selecting items for the donation. The jury verdict, her original employment contract, correspondence with university administrators, and personal items from her office would join the museum's collection. Most significantly, she donated the navy blue dress she had worn to court on the day of the verdict. This dress has become more symbolic than I ever intended, Martha told Dr. Park during the donation ceremony. I hope it reminds visitors that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they stand up for their principles. The Smithsonian exhibition, titled The Right to Work: American Labor Struggles Through the Centuries, featured Martha's case prominently alongside other milestone moments in employment law. School groups from across the country visited the exhibit, learning about workplace rights as part of their civics education. One group that particularly moved Martha was a class of high school students from rural Montana. Their teacher, Mrs. Carol Henderson, had driven 8 hours to bring her students to Washington specifically to see the exhibition. These kids come from families where grandparents and older relatives are often pushed out of work due to age. Mrs. Henderson explained to Martha during their visit, your story shows them that fighting back is possible and necessary. The students peppered Martha with questions about her decision to fight, her experience in court, and her advice for their own futures. Their energy and curiosity reminded her of why she had fallen in love with teaching decades earlier. Remember, Martha told the students, age discrimination doesn't just affect older people, it affects families, communities, and the entire economy when we waste the talents and experience of older workers. You'll be older workers someday too. As Martha approached her 90th birthday, she began experiencing the inevitable health challenges of advanced age. Her mobility decreased, her energy levels fluctuated, and she required more assistance with daily activities, but her mental acuity remained sharp, and her passion for advocacy never wavered. Her grandson, David, suggested they establish the Martha Kellerman Foundation to continue her work beyond her lifetime. The foundation would provide legal assistance to older workers facing discrimination, fund research on aging and employment, and support advocacy efforts worldwide. Grandma, your voice has been so powerful for so long, David said as they discussed the foundation's mission. We need to make sure that voice continues even when you can't personally carry on the fight. The foundation's launch attracted support from unexpected quarters. Tech giants like Google and Microsoft, once criticized for their youth-obsessed cultures, made substantial donations. Law firms that specialized in employment cases contributed both money and pro bono services. Even some universities that had been defendants in age discrimination cases became donors, seeking to demonstrate their commitment to change. The foundation's first major initiative was a national hotline for older workers facing discrimination. Staffed by retired employment lawyers and experienced advocates, the hotline provided free advice and referrals to workers who couldn't afford legal representation. Within 6 months, the hotline was receiving over 1,000 calls per month from workers across the country. The cases ranged from subtle workplace harassment to blatant forced retirement schemes. Each caller received personalized guidance and, when appropriate, referrals to legal counsel. Martha insisted on personally reviewing monthly reports from the hotline, despite her family's concerns about the emotional toll. Reading about continued discrimination was painful, but it also reinforced her belief that the fight remained necessary. Every call represents someone who refused to suffer in silence, she told the Foundation's board during one of their quarterly meetings. That's exactly what we hope to achieve, empowering people to speak up and seek help. The Foundation also funded groundbreaking research on the economic impacts of age discrimination. A study conducted by researchers at Harvard Business School found that age bias cost the American economy over $850 billion annually in lost productivity, reduced consumer spending, and increased healthcare costs. Professor Kellerman's case wasn't just about individual rights, explained Dr. Sarah Thompson, the study's lead researcher. It was about economic efficiency. When we discriminate against older workers, we're literally throwing away billions of dollars in human capital. The research provided powerful ammunition for policymakers seeking to strengthen age discrimination protections. Several states cited the Harvard study when passing enhanced anti-discrimination legislation, and federal agencies used the data to support increased enforcement efforts. As Martha's 90th birthday approached, her family planned a celebration that would also serve as a fundraiser for the foundation. The event, held at the Phoenix Convention Center, attracted over 1,500 guests from around the world. The evening featured speakers who had been influenced by Martha's case, including Supreme Court Justice Elena Rodriguez, Martha's former student, Secretary of Labor Michael Chang, and International Labor Organization Director General Dr. Fatima Al-Zahra. Martha Kellerman didn't just win a lawsuit, Justice Rodriguez said in her remarks. She sparked a global conversation about human dignity and the value of experience. Her influence extends far beyond employment law into fundamental questions about how we treat each other as human beings. The highlight of the evening was the announcement of the Martha Kellerman Global Prize for Age Equality, an annual award recognizing individuals or organizations that made significant contributions to combating age discrimination worldwide. The first recipient was Daikenji Nakamura, Martha's friend from Japan who had led the fight against mandatory retirement in Asia. As the celebration wound down, Martha found herself surrounded by well-wishers sharing stories of how her case had touched their lives. A young lawyer described how studying Martha's case in law school had inspired her to specialize in employment rights. A corporate executive explained how her company had changed its hiring practices after learning about age discrimination research. A retired teacher thanked Martha for showing her that experience was something to be proud of, not hidden. The final surprise of the evening came from an unexpected source. President Chen of Northern Arizona University announced that the institution was endowing a chair in Martha's honor, the Martha Kellerman Professorship in Social Justice and Employment Rights. The position would be held by a scholar dedicated to researching and teaching about workplace equality. Professor Kellerman, you've taught us that sometimes the most important lessons come from standing up when it would be easier to sit down, President Chen said. This chair ensures that your commitment to justice will inspire students and scholars for generations to come. As Martha looked out at the crowd of supporters, advocates, and friends who had gathered to celebrate her birthday and her impact, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. Her decision to fight had been vindicated not just by legal victory, but by the community of people who had carried her message forward. The evening ended with Martha's own brief remarks, delivered from her wheelchair but with a voice still strong with conviction. 90 years have taught me that change is possible at any age, that courage can be contagious, and that one person's stand for principle can echo around the world, she said. I may be slowing down physically, but the movement we started together continues to gain strength. That's the greatest birthday gift I could ask for. As guests departed, many stopping to shake Martha's hand or share final words of appreciation, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From a young teacher with dreams of changing the world through education, to a global symbol of resistance against age discrimination, her life had taken turns she never could have imagined. But perhaps that was the point. Life's most meaningful moments often came not from following predetermined paths, but from having the courage to stand up when circumstances demanded it. Martha had simply refused to go quietly when injustice knocked on her door, and that refusal had changed the world in ways both large and small. The legacy she was leaving behind wasn't just legal precedent or policy changes. It was the example that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they combined principle with persistence. Her voice would continue to matter long after she was gone, carried forward by the countless individuals who had found courage in her example and strength in her story. 2 years after her 90th birthday celebration, Martha received news that would bring her advocacy full circle. The United States Congress was considering the Kellerman Act, comprehensive federal legislation that would strengthen age discrimination protections across all industries and establish uniform standards for addressing age bias in the workplace. Senator Elizabeth Warren Martinez, chair of the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor and Pensions, personally called Martha to discuss the proposed legislation. Professor Kellerman, this bill represents the culmination of everything your fight started, Senator Martinez explained during their video call. We're naming it after you because your case provided the legal and moral foundation for these reforms. The Kellerman Act would close loopholes that had allowed some employers to circumvent existing age discrimination laws. It would establish mandatory training programs for managers and HR personnel, create stronger penalties for violations, and provide additional resources for enforcement agencies. Most significantly, it would extend protection to independent contractors and gig economy workers who had previously been excluded from federal anti-discrimination coverage. Martha was invited to testify before Congress in support of the legislation, despite her advanced age and declining health. Her family was concerned about the physical demands of travel to Washington, but Martha insisted on making the trip. "This may be my last chance to speak directly to the people who make our laws," she told her daughter Sarah as they prepared for the journey. "If my voice can help pass legislation that protects future generations of older workers, then I have to try." The congressional hearing room was packed with advocates, lobbyists, and media representatives when Martha arrived in her wheelchair, accompanied by David and a small medical team. At 92, she was frailer than she had been just 2 years earlier, but her eyes still held the same determination that had sustained her through her original legal battle. "Honorable members of Congress," Martha began, her voice softer than it once was but still clear and compelling. "I appear before you today, not as a legal expert or policy specialist, but as someone who has lived through the discrimination this legislation seeks to address." She spoke about her own experience, but more importantly, she contextualized it within the broader struggle for workplace equality that had defined American labor history. She drew parallels between age discrimination and other forms of workplace bias that Congress had previously addressed through landmark legislation. The same principles that drove the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Americans with Disabilities Act apply here, Martha testified. No worker should face discrimination based on characteristics that have no bearing on their ability to perform their job effectively. Her testimony was interrupted several times by applause from the gallery, and even typically partisan senators seemed moved by her words. When Senator James Richardson, a conservative Republican from Texas, asked whether the legislation might burden small businesses with excessive compliance costs, Martha's response was both pragmatic and passionate. "Senator Richardson, discrimination is far more expensive than compliance," she said. "When we force experienced workers out of their jobs, we lose their knowledge, their customer relationships, and their institutional memory. The cost of replacing that expertise far exceeds the cost of treating older workers fairly." The hearing made national news, with major networks featuring clips of Martha's testimony on their evening broadcasts. Editorial boards across the country praised her appearance, with the Washington Post calling it a masterclass in principled advocacy, and the Wall Street Journal describing her as a living reminder that experience should be valued, not discarded. The Kellerman Act passed the House of Representatives by a substantial bipartisan margin 3 months later. The Senate vote was closer, but the legislation ultimately passed with support from both parties. President Biden signed the bill into law on Martha's 93rd birthday, calling her personally to share the news. "Professor Kellerman, this is your birthday present from the American people," the president said during their call. "Your courage has created a safer, fairer workplace for millions of older Americans." The signing ceremony took place in the Rose Garden, with Martha participating via video link from her home in Scottsdale. Despite her physical absence, she was the emotional centerpiece of the event, with speaker after speaker acknowledging her role in making the legislation possible. As the law took effect, its impact was immediate and measurable. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission reported a 40% increase in age discrimination complaints in the first year. Not because discrimination had increased, but because workers now felt empowered to report violations and knew they had stronger legal protections. Corporate America responded with comprehensive policy changes. Major companies established chief diversity officers specifically responsible for age inclusion, created mentorship programs, pairing older and younger workers, and implemented bias training focused on age-related stereotypes. The technology sector, once notorious for its youth obsession, underwent a particularly dramatic transformation. Companies like Apple, Amazon, and Facebook launched initiatives to recruit older workers, recognizing that age diversity enhanced innovation and customer understanding. Tim Johnson, a 65-year-old software engineer who had been unemployed for 2 years due to age bias, found himself with multiple job offers after the Kellerman Act's passage. Companies that wouldn't even interview me before are now actively recruiting older tech workers, he told a reporter from TechCrunch. The cultural shift has been remarkable. The law's international influence was equally significant. The European Union updated its employment directives to incorporate elements of the Kellerman Act, and the United Nations cited the legislation as a model for global age discrimination reforms. Martha's health continued to decline as she entered her mid-90s, but she remained intellectually engaged with the movement she had inspired. Her great-granddaughter Emma, now in law school, became her primary liaison with the foundation and advocacy organizations worldwide. Great-grandma, you have messages from advocates in 37 countries, congratulating you on the Kellerman Act, Emma reported during one of their daily visits. There's also an invitation from the International Court of Justice to speak about age discrimination as a human rights issue. While Martha was no longer able to travel internationally, she participated in global conferences through video technology, sharing her insights with advocates working to combat age discrimination in their own countries. Her virtual appearances drew audiences in the thousands, with simultaneous translation making her words accessible to advocates worldwide. One particularly meaningful connection came through a video conference with a group of older women workers in Mumbai, India, who were fighting age discrimination in the textile industry. Despite vast cultural and economic differences, their struggle echoed themes from Martha's own experience decades earlier. Sister Martha, said Priya Sharma, a 60-year-old seamstress and labor organizer, your example shows us that fighting injustice is possible at any age. We draw strength from your courage and apply your strategies to our own battles. The conversation reminded Martha that workplace discrimination was truly a global phenomenon that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. The principles she had fought for, dignity, respect, and equal treatment, were universal human values that resonated across continents. As Martha's 95th birthday approached, her family began planning what they knew might be her final major celebration. The Martha Kellerman Foundation organized a global symposium titled A Century of Courage, celebrating 95 years of Martha Kellerman, bringing together advocates, researchers, and policymakers from around the world. The 3-day event, held virtually due to Martha's health and ongoing global health concerns, featured presentations on the lasting impact of her case, discussions of current challenges in age discrimination, and planning sessions for future advocacy efforts. Dr. Amanda Foster, now a distinguished professor herself, delivered the opening keynote address. Professor Kellerman's legacy extends far beyond any single legal case or piece of legislation, she said. She fundamentally changed how we think about aging, work, and human value. Her influence will be felt for generations to come. The symposium featured remarkable testimonials from individuals whose lives had been touched by Martha's story. A 90-year-old doctor from Sweden described how Martha's case had inspired her to challenge mandatory retirement policies in European medicine. A 75-year-old engineer from South Korea explained how the Kellerman precedent had been used to reform age discrimination laws throughout Asia. Most moving was a presentation by a group of Martha's former students, now accomplished professionals in their 50s and 60s, who had organized themselves into the Kellerman Alumni Network. They had created a scholarship fund for students interested in studying age discrimination and workplace equality. Professor Kellerman didn't just teach us about literature, said Dr. Michael Torres, now a department chair himself. She taught us about justice, perseverance, and the power of standing up for what's right. Those lessons shaped our entire careers. The symposium's final session was dedicated to future challenges and opportunities. Despite the progress made since Martha's original case, participants identified emerging forms of age discrimination related to technology adoption, changing work patterns, and evolving economic structures. Dr. Jennifer Park from the Smithsonian moderated a panel discussion on the next generation of age advocates, featuring younger activists who were building on Martha's foundation while addressing contemporary challenges. Professor Kellerman's generation fought for basic recognition and legal protection, said Maria Gonzalez, a 35-year-old labor organizer. Our generation must tackle algorithmic bias in hiring, age discrimination in the gig economy, and the intersection of ageism with other forms of discrimination. As the symposium concluded, Martha delivered what would be her final major public address. Speaking from her home, with Emma beside her for support, she reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple refusal to accept forced retirement. When I was told I was too old to matter, I could never have imagined that proving them wrong would become a lifetime mission, she said, her voice still carrying traces of the passion that had sustained her for so many years. But perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. We never know when our moment of courage will come, or how far its impact will reach. She spoke directly to the young advocates participating in the symposium, encouraging them to carry forward the fight against all forms of workplace discrimination. The work is not finished, Martha concluded. Each generation faces new challenges and must find new ways to ensure that all workers are treated with dignity and respect. I have confidence that you will continue this mission with the same determination that has brought us this far. The symposium ended with the announcement of the Martha Kellerman Global Endowment, a permanent fund that would support age discrimination research and advocacy efforts worldwide. The endowment, funded by contributions from governments, corporations, and individuals across 6 continents, would ensure that Martha's work continued long after her passing. As participants logged off from the virtual symposium, many expressed a sense of both completion and beginning. Completion of Martha's active involvement in the movement she had created, and the beginning of a new phase carried forward by a global network of advocates inspired by her example. In the quiet of her Scottsdale home, surrounded by family and a lifetime of memories, Martha felt a deep sense of peace. She had proven beyond any doubt that she mattered, not just to her students and colleagues, but to millions of workers around the world who would benefit from the changes she had initiated. Her great-granddaughter Emma sat beside her, reading aloud from the hundreds of messages that had poured in from around the world following the symposium. Each message represented a life touched, a career saved, or a battle inspired by Martha's courage to stand up and fight back. As the Arizona sun set over the desert landscape that had been her home for so many decades, Martha reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken and the legacy she would leave behind. She had started as a young teacher with dreams of educating students, and she was ending as a global symbol of resistance against discrimination and justice. The months following the global symposium brought a series of honors and recognitions that would have overwhelmed Martha in her younger years, but now served as gentle reminders of the impact her life had created. The Nobel Committee announced that the 2037 Peace Prize would be awarded posthumously to advocates for workplace equality and human dignity, with Martha's case cited as foundational to the global movement. Harvard Law School established the Kellerman Institute for Employment Justice, bringing together legal scholars, economists, and social scientists to study emerging forms of workplace discrimination. The Institute's inaugural conference drew over 1,000 participants from 93 countries, making it the largest gathering of employment rights advocates in history. Dean Patricia Morrison, of Harvard Law School, traveled personally to Scottsdale to present Martha with the Institute's charter documents. Professor Kellerman, Your case is taught in every employment law course in America and increasingly around the world," Dean Morrison said during the private ceremony in Martha's living room. "This institute will ensure that your intellectual legacy continues to evolve and address new challenges." The charter establishing the Kellerman Institute contained language that moved Martha deeply. Dedicated to the principle that human dignity knows no expiration date, and that experience constitutes society's most valuable resource, the Institute would focus not just on legal remedies for discrimination, but on changing cultural attitudes about aging and work. Martha's influence extended into unexpected realms as well. The World Health Organization published a landmark study linking workplace age discrimination to increased rates of depression, cognitive decline, and premature mortality among older adults. The research, titled The Kellerman Effect: Health Impacts of Age-Based Employment Discrimination, provided medical evidence for what Martha had long argued on moral grounds. Professor Kellerman's fight was ultimately about public health as much as legal rights, explained Dr. Sarah Chen, the study's lead researcher. "When we force capable older workers into unwanted retirement, we're not just wasting human resources, we're literally shortening lives and increasing healthcare costs." The WHO study prompted medical associations worldwide to classify workplace age discrimination as a public health crisis. Medical schools began incorporating age discrimination awareness into their curricula, training future doctors to recognize and address the health impacts of ageism in employment. As Martha entered her 96th year, she experienced a resurgence of energy that surprised her medical team. James Rodriguez, her longtime physician, attributed the phenomenon to what he called legacy vitality, the psychological boost that came from seeing one's life work validated and continued by others. "Mrs. Kellerman, your cognitive function and emotional well-being are remarkable for someone your age," Dr. Rodriguez observed during a routine checkup. "I believe the knowledge that your work continues to help others is providing you with a sense of purpose that's literally keeping you going." This renewed energy allowed Martha to participate in one final major project that would cement her educational legacy. Stanford University's Graduate School of Education approached her about developing a curriculum on advocacy and social justice leadership that would be taught at education schools nationwide. Working with Dr. Lisa Park, a curriculum specialist, Martha spent months developing case studies, discussion materials, and practical exercises based on her own experience and the broader movement she had inspired. The curriculum would teach future educators not just how to navigate workplace discrimination, but how to become advocates for systemic change. "Professor Kellerman, what you're creating isn't just an academic course," Dr. Park explained during one of their working sessions. "You're developing a blueprint for how educators can become change agents in their communities and professions." The curriculum modules covered everything from recognizing subtle discrimination to building coalitions for change, from understanding legal remedies to developing media strategies for advocacy campaigns. Martha insisted that each module include international perspectives, drawing on the global network of advocates she had connected with over the years. The pilot program launched at 12 universities across the United States, with additional institutions in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom expressing interest in adaptation. Students enrolled in the course came from diverse backgrounds: future teachers, administrators, policy researchers, and social justice advocates. Feedback from the pilot programs was overwhelmingly positive. Sarah Kim, a graduate student at Stanford, wrote in her course evaluation, "Professor Kellerman's curriculum taught me that advocacy isn't just about knowing your rights, it's about having the courage to stand up for them and the skills to create lasting change." The success of the curriculum led to an unexpected invitation that would bring Martha's story full circle once more. The American Federation of Teachers, the nation's largest teachers' union, asked her to deliver the keynote address at their centennial convention. At 96, Martha would become the oldest keynote speaker in the union's history. The AFT convention in Chicago drew over 15,000 educators from across the country. Martha's appearance, via high-definition video link from Arizona, was the convention's most anticipated event. Many attendees had grown up hearing stories about the professor who had changed employment law by refusing to be pushed aside. "My fellow educators," Martha began, her voice carrying clearly through the massive convention hall. "We gather here 100 years after teachers first organized to demand respect, fair wages, and professional dignity. I stand before you today as proof that the fight for educator rights continues, and that victory is possible when we stand together." Her speech wove together themes from her own experience with the broader history of teacher advocacy. She spoke about the parallels between the early unionization movement and the contemporary fight against age discrimination, emphasizing that both struggles were fundamentally about professional respect and human dignity. "When they told me I was too old to matter, they were really saying that experience has no value, that wisdom is worthless, that dedication counts for nothing," Martha said. "But you, all of you in this hall and watching around the world, have proven them wrong. You've shown that teachers matter at every age, that our profession values experience alongside innovation." The speech was interrupted multiple times by standing ovations, with 15,000 educators rising to their feet to honor the woman who had fought not just for her own rights, but for the principle that all workers deserved respect regardless of their age. Martha's appearance at the AFT convention was covered extensively by education media and prompted renewed discussion about the ongoing challenges facing older educators. While legal protections had strengthened significantly since her original case, subtle forms of discrimination persisted in some school districts. The convention response led to the creation of the AFT Age Equity Task Force, charged with developing resources and strategies to combat age discrimination in education. The task force would work directly with the Martha Kellerman Foundation to share best practices and coordinate advocacy efforts. As 2037 drew to a close, Martha received news that would serve as a capstone to her extraordinary journey. Time magazine had selected her as one of the 100 most influential people of the 21st century, citing her role in transforming workplace rights and challenging ageist assumptions globally. The Time profile, written by Supreme Court Justice Elena Rodriguez, Martha's former student, captured both the personal and societal impact of her fight. Martha Kellerman's refusal to accept discrimination didn't just change employment law, it changed how humanity thinks about aging, work, and human value. Her legacy will protect workers for generations to come. The magazine's photographers came to Scottsdale for what would be Martha's final formal portrait session. At 96, she sat in her favorite chair surrounded by mementos from her decades of advocacy, letters from supporters worldwide, awards from legal organizations, photographs with presidents and prime ministers, and her original jury verdict from 2021. "Mrs. Kellerman," said photographer David Chen, "I want to capture not just how you look, but who you are. Your eyes still hold the same determination that carried you through that courtroom battle 16 years ago." The resulting portrait would grace the cover of Time's special Century of Change issue, showing Martha as both an elderly woman and a timeless symbol of resistance against injustice. The image would become iconic, reproduced in textbooks, museums, and advocacy materials worldwide. As winter settled over Arizona, Martha spent increasing amounts of time in quiet reflection, reviewing the thousands of letters and messages she had received over the years. Each represented a life touched by her decision to fight, a career saved by her courage, or a battle inspired by her example. One letter that particularly moved her came from Dr. Yuki Tanaka, now in her 70s and serving as president of Tokyo University. Dr. Tanaka had been a young faculty member when Martha's case first made international news, and the president had protected her from age discrimination throughout her own career. "Professor Kellerman," Dr. Tanaka wrote, "I became university president at 73 because your fight made it possible for older academics to be valued rather than discarded. Every day I serve in this role, I think of your courage and try to live up to the example you set." Similar messages arrived from corporate executives, government officials, teachers, nurses, engineers, and workers in countless other professions who had benefited from the cultural and legal changes Martha's case had initiated. Each story reinforced her belief that standing up for principle could create ripples that spread far beyond their origins. Her great-granddaughter Emma, now graduated from law school and working for the Martha Kellerman Foundation, spent hours each day reading these messages aloud to her great-grandmother. Emma had inherited not just Martha's intelligence, but also her sense of justice and determination to help others. Great-grandma, Emma said during one of their afternoon sessions, "I received a message today from a group of older workers in Nigeria who successfully challenged discriminatory retirement policies using precedents from your case. They call themselves the Kellerman Circle of Lagos." The international reach of Martha's influence continued to astonish her family and supporters. What had begun as a local employment dispute in Flagstaff had somehow become a global movement that transcended cultural, economic, and political boundaries. As Martha approached her 97th birthday, she began experiencing what her doctors described as natural decline associated with extreme old age. Her energy levels decreased, and she required more assistance with daily activities, but her mind remained sharp, and her interest in the continuing advocacy efforts never wavered. The Martha Kellerman Foundation announced that her birthday would be marked by the launch of the Global Age Equity Initiative, a collaborative effort involving the United Nations, the International Labor Organization, and advocacy groups from over 100 countries. The initiative would create binding international standards for age discrimination prevention and establish enforcement mechanisms to protect older workers worldwide. "This initiative represents Professor Kellerman's ultimate victory," said Dr. Maria Santos, now serving as the Foundation's executive director. "Her individual fight has become a universal principle recognized by the international community." The birthday celebration was necessarily quiet, held in Martha's home with close family members and a small group of longtime supporters. But around the world, advocacy groups, universities, and government agencies held events honoring her 97 years of life and 16 years of advocacy leadership. In Geneva, the United Nations held a special session on age discrimination featuring speakers from 6 continents. In Tokyo, thousands of older workers gathered in solidarity rallies. In London, Parliament passed a resolution honoring Martha's contributions to international labor rights. In Ottawa, the Canadian government announced new funding for age discrimination research inspired by the Kellerman precedent. As these global celebrations unfolded, Martha sat quietly in her Scottsdale living room, surrounded by family and reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the young woman she had once been, eager to change the world through education, and marveled at how life had given her the opportunity to impact far more lives than she had ever imagined possible in a classroom. Her daughter Sarah, now in her 70s herself, sat beside her mother's chair, holding her hand as they watched news coverage of the worldwide celebrations. "Mom, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had just accepted retirement quietly back in 2019? Martha smiled, her eyes still holding traces of the fire that had sustained her through years of fighting. "I try not to think about alternate histories, Sarah, but I do know that every voice matters, every stand for principle counts, and every act of courage can change the world. I'm grateful I found mine when it mattered most. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.